What is the difference between the national minimum wage and the national living wage? Well, in this video, I'm going to answer that question. If you haven't seen the channel before, we do videos aimed to help employees, and that's employees either in work or those seeking work. The purpose of the channel is to give you a very real insight into how things work and read between the lines. This way we give you an honest picture of what's really going on. If you like the sound of this type of content, do consider subscribing to the channel, and if you do, don't forget to click the bell icon so you won't miss any one of our forthcoming videos. So right off the bat, first of all, the national living wage and the national minimum wage, well, they are two different things. There is a little bit of difference in the history because the national minimum wage came in first. Now, depending on who you ask, they might think, well, it's been around for years and years. And some people might go, well, it's a recent thing, isn't it? Well, it was actually passed in 1998 by the Labour government, and it came into effect in 1999. Whereas the national living wage, well, that came into effect much more recently in 2016. And to make things a little bit more complicated, even though the national minimum wage came in first in the 90s, the national living wage, the idea of it was actually discussed originally way back in the 1870s. The main difference in ideas between the two is the national minimum wage is what legally a company has to pay staff as a bare minimum, and the national living wage is what is considered as a fair representation of what you should be employed by and what you should be paid by as a bare minimum if you want to be fair, let's say. So you'd think with that, well, there must be some discrepancy or a notable difference in the two figures. National living wage is often seen from a media perspective, if you do hear about it, as that's what companies should be paying staff as a minimum. So you'd be forgiven for thinking that there must be a notable difference, maybe a couple of quid an hour difference, right? Well, that's not actually the case. In fact, they're pretty closely aligned, and I'll go on to my theories of this in a little bit, but here's the exact amounts. The national minimum wage is £9.50 per hour if you are over the age of 23 or 23 and above. The national living wage, and remember that's the one which is actually meant to be the fair representation of what you should be paid, not the minimum that you could legally be paid, well, that's only paying £9.90 an hour, so only a difference in 40p per hour. Unless, of course, you live in London where it's £11.5 per hour, but with extra costs in London, it's offset anyway, so it doesn't really make that much difference. But there's only 40p difference in, if you was living in Manchester, for example, between the national minimum wage and the national living wage. Another thing to add with the national minimum wage and the national living wage is that not only do they go up or get readjusted and have gone up every year for the last few years, certainly I've got records at least the last 5 years of them going up, the reality is, depending on your age, it differs as well. If you're 23 or above, the numbers that I've just given you, they're correct. But then if you go down in age, from 21 to 22, from 18 to 20, under 18, they differ. And also, if you're an apprentice, which you'd think with apprentices, with a shortage we have of skills in this country, you'd probably think, well, you want to encourage people to go into apprenticeships rather than, let's say, go to university, where it's just an academic skill set rather than a physical skill set, because we have a shortage of people in skilled trades. You'd think that would probably be a higher amount to encourage people. Well, if you've done an apprenticeship, or you know people who've done apprenticeships, they don't pay very well. And the government wonders why we've got skill shortages. Well, that's probably one of the reasons why, and that's maybe another story for another video. If you do want to see one on my thoughts on apprentice wages and more information on that kind of stuff, put it in the comments below and I'll try and do a video on that. But for the minute, let's stick with this video. But as a quick example with the apprentice wage, if you think that £9.50 an hour is minimum wage for a 23-year-old is pretty bad, or that if you're an 18-year-old, £6.83 is pretty awful, well, think of £4.81 an hour if you're an apprentice. Yeah, that's really bad. You're not going to make much money out of that, are you? But there are two arguments at play here when it comes to the national minimum wage and the national living wage. One argument from, let's say, the government would argue that the national minimum wage is a fair representation of what people actually need in this country. But the reality is, and I'll give you some numbers, if you was on the national minimum wage, that equates to you earning £13,650 per year. Now, you're going to take tax out of that, but most people, as an average tax bracket will be for the first 12,500 that they earn, they won't be charged any tax on it. So the reality is that if you're earning 13.5 grand, you're only really going to be taxed about, 20% of that £1,000 extra over the threshold. So you're not going to be taxed that much in reality, but you'll still have some of that taken out of your pocket. But 13,500, is that really what someone actually needs in the UK? Now, I don't think I can honestly sit here and say that anyone watching this video is going to go, yeah, I could survive on 13,500, certainly if they're trying to live on their own and sustain a normal living. If you're still living with parents, if you're living with family, the house is bought, you haven't got to worry about rent, bills, anything like that, and all of that 13,500 is disposable income, then yeah, you probably can live on that because you don't need all of it. But if you need that to go and live on, if we go from that argument, is £13,500 really enough for what people need to live on? Let's be honest, it isn't. You've got the cost of living crisis. If you haven't seen our videos on the cost of living crisis, we've done a couple, and this is kind of not directly linked to them, but in that kind of series, if you like. I'm going to put the link up there, and I'll put the link somewhere, and it will certainly be at the end credits anyway, so you can watch our previous video to this. But for sticking on point of this video, that 13,500 from our own research, that's not going to be anywhere near enough for someone to go and live on. Now, there's been a bit of research from a few bodies to actually try and work out how much someone needs as a minimum in the UK. Now, studies tend to take a little while to get the data, to process all this kind of stuff. And with the inflation that we're experiencing in the UK at the moment, and this is being recorded in July 2022, then it's going up like a rocket. So some of this data might be out of sync, but this is the most recent data we've been able to get. So the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which was basically, it was an economist from about 100 years ago or so, Joseph Rowntree. Well, this foundation was based on it, but his idea of economy was to try and find what actually works for the general people. Well, they worked out that you're going to need £17,900 a year as a minimum to be able to live on. £17,900 a year. Well, 13,500 versus 17,900, well, that's quite a percentage of difference. The literal gap in there from what people can earn, considering there's an awful lot of people on national living wage or national minimum wage, well, that's going to result in an awful lot of poverty. It was difficult for people before the cost of living crisis came about, but now with rocketing prices quite quickly, you're finding yourself in a very, very difficult position if you are on national minimum or national living wage. So hopefully that gives you the answer to what the difference between the national living wage is and what the national minimum wage is, and also my thoughts on how you sort all this out and whether someone can actually live on it or not. If you like this content, you like this video, do give us a big like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and click the bell icon so you don't miss any one of our videos, and we will see you for the next one.